Over the last decade, there has been a flourishing of writing at the intersection of disability and sexuality studies. Theoretically bold work informed by queer theory that radically challenges normativity and militantly asserts bodily difference. My latest book owes its inspiration to that body of work, sometimes called crip theory, to writers like Robert McRuer, Eli Clare, and Riva Lehrer. Unlike the work that inspired me, however, my book includes in its intersectional focus not just disability and sexuality, but also aging. It is generally recognized not only that disability and aging studies frequently have common cause, but also that there is a wide swath where the categories of disability and aging bleed into each other. For example, Michael Berube, a leading figure in disability studies, writes, "The fact that many of us will have become disabled if we live long enough is perhaps the fundamental aspect of human embodiment." In such a statement, disability becomes pretty much synonymous with aging. Statements like this are found everywhere in disability studies, suggesting a widespread recognition that disability cannot be separated as a category from aging. Yet, despite the frequency of this gesture, there is little critical or theoretical work that draws from both disability and aging studies. My new book has the good fortune to benefit from both of these critical traditions. The focus of my book is, in fact, the swath of experience that could be equally understood either as disability or as aging. The experience of what I call late onset disability, disability beginning in the middle years or beyond. My particular subject is how late onset disability is lived sexually. My new book traces how late onset disability is lived as a threat to one's sexuality and to one's gender. But the book also traces how sexuality survives and transforms in the process. A sexuality becoming, in these older, less able subjects, more perverse from a normative standpoint, more deviant from an ageist, ableist standpoint. Taking its anti-normative audacity from queer and especially crip theory, Sexuality, Disability, and Aging explores and celebrates the perverse sexuality of the no longer young, no longer fit. While disability studies has generated so much lively queer theory, and vice versa, there is virtually no work at the intersection of queer theory and aging. Yet there is, in fact, an obvious place where the two could easily and productively connect. For more than a decade, the most influential trend in queer theory has been the exploration of what is called queer temporality. Scholars as diverse and as influential as Jack Halberstam, Lee Edelman, and Elizabeth Freeman, to name just three, have brought the resistance to normativity and the valuation of alternative lives that characterize queer theory to bear on various aspects of temporality. A queer angle on temporality has obvious relevance for aging, which is all about temporality, which is literally the lived experience of temporality. Yet although theorists of queer temporality have focused on childhood and adolescence, and despite the obvious relevance, there is virtually no work applying queer temporality to aging adults. The concept of temporalities in my subtitle arose from the application of all this wonderful theorizing of queer time to the question of adult aging. The subtitle's inclusion of the phallus, on the other hand, is, I imagine, more surprising, more troubling, and needs more explanation. This is especially true because the notion has fallen out of favor in the last 20 years of theorizing sexuality. As someone who, decades ago, contributed to the feminist critique of the psychoanalytic concept of the phallus, I was surprised to find the term suggesting itself as I worked on this project. On the basis of the work I was doing, I came to believe that the reintroduction of the notion of the phallus, denatured by 3 decades of queer theory, has a substantial contribution to make to our theorization of sexuality as lived in and over time. I thus found myself returning to texts by Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, and Judith Butler to craft a usable notion of the phallus, with emphasis on its temporalities and with application beyond androcentrism. In this exploration of a viable phallus, Butler's 1992 article on the lesbian phallus, in particular, points in a valuable direction not taken up in queer theory since then. In psychoanalytic theory, the phallus is conceptually inseparable from castration. This makes the phallus an essentially temporal concept. The phallus is what one had in the past but lost, or what one has in the present but fears losing in the future. This is the normative temporality of the phallus, that the phallus has been or will be lost, that the phallus is imbued with pastness, whether in the present or in the future. This overwhelming pastness of the phallus, its insistent connection to loss, even when it is present, is what we call psychoanalytically castration anxiety. Both late onset disability and aging are experienced as threats to one's sexuality and to one's gender, regardless of the gender with which one identifies. This sense of impending loss, a loss tangling together gender and sexuality, can best be understood, I propose, as a form of castration anxiety. The psychoanalytic notion of castration anxiety is thus useful for thinking about how aging and late onset disability are lived sexually. In the standard narrative we call castration anxiety, once the phallus is lost, it is lost forever. In addition to outlining this normative temporality, my book explores other temporalities of the phallus, alternatives to the lose it once and for all normative temporality, alternatives to the phallus's insistent relegation to the past. In addition to articulating the phallus as a temporal concept in its traditional psychoanalytic formulation, this book tracks alternative temporalities, where one could move from castration to phallus as well as in the other direction, where the lost phallus is surprisingly regained, or where the phallus might appear not only in the past, but as a promising future. These alternatives participate in the promise of queer temporality and may even lead to queerer phalluses and less anxious castrations. The temporality of castration anxiety is the scenario of an impending future losing it once and for all. As it turns out, this is the prospect we find over and over, both in late onset disability and in midlife aging. This is the temporality that Margaret Morgenroth Gallett, scholar of midlife aging, calls the decline story. Connecting Gallett's decline story to the psychoanalytic notion of castration anxiety is central to the theoretical underpinnings of my new book. In her 1997 book, Declining to Decline, Gallett fleshes out the concept of the decline story by telling about the debilitating back pain that befell her at age 49. Her story is a good example of my book's particular focus, a disability whose onset arises in midlife, an experience that can be equally understood as either disability or aging. Although as a scholar of aging, Gallett understands her experience through the rubric of aging. She writes of what this late onset disability means to her. I had been a strong, active woman. What a wonderful thing to be. I was proud of my strength, and the things it enabled me to do gave me a lot of pleasure. That is what I lost. When you can't do what you once liked to do, whatever that is, you fear you're becoming a different person. This fear you're becoming a different person is what I would call castration anxiety. She goes to see an orthopedic surgeon who tells her, "You're not an old woman, but you have to be careful. You can't do the things you did when you were young." The visit to this doctor leaves her in a state of abject loss. It took me only a few hours to figure out that I had just gotten the worst news of my personal life, she writes. I extrapolated from the nerve pain I had been feeling. Whenever that began to worsen, my workday would gradually shorten. I would slowly become disabled and dependent. I was plunged into planning my suicide. The doctor pronounces, "You can't do the things you did when you were young." The patient hears that, imagines a future of progressive decline, and is plunged into planning her suicide. Gallett's book teaches us that such moments of entrance into catastrophic loss typify our culture's construction of aging. Gallett is lucky enough to consult another doctor who gives her a different story about the same diagnosis. This second story allows her some distance from the decline story the first doctor pronounced. In her life and in her work, Gallett devotes herself to declining to decline, to resisting the cultural dominance of the decline story. The chapter on her midlife back pain ends thus. Chronic suffering takes different forms. If we ever begin to listen, the sufferers will have a lot of alternative stories to tell. Inexorability doesn't express the way our waves of knowledge come to us, the way we discover our private response at the same time we endure what feels like bodily injustice. In my new book, I join Gallett in listening to these alternative stories, stories that can provide alternatives to what she here calls inexorability, which is another name for the decline story, which I recognize as another name for the standard temporality of castration. By drawing together the various temporalities of castration encountered in these alternative stories, my book lays out a vision of sexuality that is insistently temporal, and a temporal sexuality that is not normatively tragic, but multi-directional, holding open the possibility of queer phallic surprises and post-castratory delights for older and less able adults. The texts I consider in the book span a range from literary fiction to academic theory. In my search for alternative stories, I pay special attention to writing from critical aging studies and crip theory that combines personal memoir with critical theorizing, a combination I've elsewhere called anecdotal theory. Gallett's inclusion of her personal story in her academic critique of decline is an example of this from aging studies. The alternative stories I discuss in the next section of this talk are examples from crip theory. The rest of what I will present to you this evening consists of two sections from the book. Both sections are from a larger chapter entitled High Heels and Wheelchairs. As you might imagine from the title, the chapter focuses on mobility issues, more specifically on issues around walking and prosthetic apparatuses. The first section I will present here is entitled Gender and Disability. The second is entitled The Phallus and the Wheelchair. Gender and Disability. Eli Clare's Exile and Pride, first published in 1999, one of the first books to combine queer and disability perspectives, is now a classic text of crip theory. Clare teaches us to think the intersection of gender and disability. The mannerisms that help define gender, Clare writes, the ways in which people walk, swing their hips, take up space with their bodies, are all based upon how non-disabled people move. A woman who walks with crutches does not walk like a woman. A man who uses a wheelchair does not move like a man. The construction of gender depends not only upon the male body and female body, but also upon the non-disabled body. For my chapter, High Heels and Wheelchairs, I am, of course, particularly interested in Clare's focus on gender and walking. Clare's The Ways in Which People Walk, Swing Their Hips makes me think of Riva Lehrer talking about walking and the norms of femininity in her wonderful 2012 text, Golem Girl Gets Lucky. She would sway with a spine strung in a sinuous rosary of bones, writes Lehrer. She should undulate with a hide and seek of the hips and the breasts. In Lair's sense of the disabled body's exclusion from gender norms, she notes how her viewpoint is at odds with a certain feminist idea. Women's studies has taught us to see the damage caused by rigid gendering, but there is a different kind of confusion and hurt caused by its absence, when it's clear that you're not being included because you've been disqualified. Disabled women must continually claim their gender in the face of active erasure. Claire and Lair give enough of their personal stories in their writing that we know both are lifelong non-normative walkers. Their experience as thus excluded from gender norms results in a particularly valuable reconsideration of gender, especially because both are deeply familiar with feminist theory. Both recognize the truth of the feminist critique of rigid gendering, but insist on amplifying and altering that from the perspective of disabled gender trouble. As valuable as Claire and Lair are for explicating the relation between gender and normative walking, their temporality is not the one I'm concerned with here. For my purposes, I am drawn to a group of writers whose crip gender trouble comes upon them in adult life, wreaking havoc upon their already formed gender identities. I will here cite 3 of these writers, not only because they display the temporality of late-onset disability, but also because the gender identities threatened by their disabilities are not male-female, but butch-femme, queer gender. In a 1992 collection of butch-femme writings, I found Mary Frances Platt talking about wheelchair use and femme identity. As lives go, mine changed, she writes, slowly at first and then more dramatically. Recurring back pain and limited range of motion. Soon after came decreased mobility. I began to use a 3-wheeled power chair. The more disabled I became, the more I mourned the ways my sexual femme self had manifested through the non-disabled me. Let us note the temporality of Platt's story. Her life changed, a slow decline ending in a wheelchair. Platt entitles her little essay, Reclaiming Femme Again, because she frames her difficulty claiming femme identity after disability as a repetition of an earlier difficulty. The 70s brand of white feminism had me trimming my nails and cutting off my hair. Soon I was outfitted in farmer jeans and high tops. Eventually I pulled the pieces of my being back together and proclaimed boldly, I am a working-class lesbian femme. So I had maybe 6 years of unleashing my seductive femme self when, as lives go, mine changed. Fighting against the loss of femme identity because of her disability feels like a repetition of her fight against the 70s feminist rejection of that identity. I identify with Platt's relation to 70s feminism, and even more with her mourning her femme self. But what I love most about her essay is the sexy twist she gives to the image of the wheelchair. I hang out more with the sexual outlaws now. You know, the motorcycle lesbians who see wheels and chrome between your legs as something exciting. An essay published 7 years later in a collection of lesbian writing on disability tells a similar story of femme identity threatened by disability. Like Platt, Sharon Waxler has chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, but Waxler also has multiple chemical sensitivity. She feels a similar threat to her femme identity, but not because of mobility issues. When I lost the markers of femme identity, she writes, I missed them terribly and wondered if I was still femme. One of the most upsetting losses was makeup, specifically lipstick. Waxler's loss throws her into a struggle with gender identity. It is this loss that threatens gender identity that I am here calling castration. While classic psychoanalytic theory believes castration is the loss of masculinity, this lesbian femme writing suggests that one can also experience the loss of femininity as castration. In her essay, Waxler prefaces her own dilemma with a story of another lesbian confronting disability. A year before her own fall into what she calls the deep, murky waters of illness and disability, Wachsler attends the monthly Femme Butch Rap at the Gay and Lesbian Health Center. I remember one woman in particular with soft red hair, Wachsler recounts. She said she had a disability and it made her question her identity as butch. Wasn't the butch supposed to be the doer? The one who says, "Let me get that for you, honey"? I remember thinking, I guess that's not a problem if you're femme. That last line is ironic because this recollection is the lead-in to the problems disability poses for Wachsler's femme identity. But that's not a problem if you're femme is also true if by that we mean the relation between disability and being the doer. While both butches and femmes experience castration anxiety in response to disability, our particular anxieties point to gender-differentiated ways of being phallic. Classic psychoanalytic theory proposes that masculinity has to do with having the phallus, whereas femininity with being the phallus. Our reading of lesbian writing here might revise that as, while femmes are phallic because of how they look, butches are phallic because of what they do. A particularly moving account of butch confrontation with disability appeared in the 2003 special issue of the queer theory journal GLQ on disability studies. This remarkable text certainly echoes Wachsler's red-headed butch in her sense that the butch is the doer. But whereas Wachsler's butch does chivalrous things like, "Get that for you, honey," in S. Naomi Finkelstein's text, the butch's doing is explicitly and graphically sexual. "How can I be a butch without my hands?" she writes. "How can I fuck when my muscles shudder as a result? One of the worst things by far is that I cannot feel the nerves in her cunt or asshole as I used to. I cannot move deftly enough over her clit. I cannot bend my neck to eat her out or rim her." The issue of GLQ where Finkelstein's text appears is entitled "Desiring Disability." I love this title for its promise of bringing desire to the place of disability. No text in this rich double-length special issue does this better than Finkelstein's. I'm tempted to quote way too much. The opening is flat out sexy. "She is lying on my bed, ass up. Jesus, I love her ass. She has opened herself for me." That interjected Jesus speaks from the place of Finkelstein's desire. After 2 pages of hardcore description of sexual activity, disability makes its unwelcome entrance. "If it is possible to fuck her as hard as we both want, then I am doing just that. My arm is at an angle that my neck, with 3 bone spurs going into my vertebrae, does not like. My body starts to shake. My arm and then my hand go numb. I'm still fucking her, but I cannot feel the smooth inside of her anymore, and my neck is screaming in anguish." Finkelstein nonetheless succeeds in making her femme come. "My back is in a spasm, but I ignore it. I finish fucking her through gritted teeth. She comes. She finishes." After describing in some detail the physical manifestations of her femme's orgasm, she writes, "In my mind's eye, my own cock explodes as she comes. I get that much pleasure from her climax." "In my mind's eye, my own cock explodes," she writes. "This is surely in part why, in my attempt to understand queer modes of the phallus, I so value Finkelstein." Despite the detailed account of the butch's pain, the episode is sexy to read, with the exception of the final paragraph. Here's how the story ends. "While she rests, I go into the bathroom to take a muscle relaxant and to the kitchen to get an ice bag. The next day I have to go to the emergency room for Toradol, a major anti-inflammatory that leaves me unable to eat for 2 days because it makes me nauseous and gives me the runs, but it does take the swelling down." The end of her story is literally anticlimactic, but the ending of the story is not the end of Finkelstein's text. Powerful as it is, the anecdote only takes up about a quarter of the text. The rest is not narrative, but thoughts about her life as a crip butch, which includes not only candor about her disability, but also insistence on her ongoing sexuality, on her persistent desire. Like Platt and Waxler, Finkelstein experiences her disability as a threat to her gender identity, but probably because her identity is butch, not femme, it is easier to hear that threat as castration. How is a butch supposed to stay butch when her body is not cooperating? I have felt emasculated by my disease. As I try to think through the temporalities of castration here, tracing the ways that adult onset disability affects the phallus, Finkelstein's text is particularly valuable to me. Like Platt, Finkelstein experiences the threat disability poses to her gender identity as a repetition. Platt, titling her essay Reclaiming Femme Again, frames disability's threat to her identity as a repetition of the 70s feminist rejection of femme. Finkelstein connects disability's threat to society's disapproval of butch women. I have paid many a price for being butch. Hell, I have almost been killed more than once for being a butch. I have lived with all these sanctions and stayed a butch because of my fierce love for women, my need to be inside them. But how can I be a butch without my hands? After all I have lived through and endured, I face losing the capacity to be butch. Damn, that has to be a bad joke. I'm interested in the temporality suggested by both Platt and Finkelstein. In their accounts, disability's threat to gender is a repetition. They experienced a similar threat long before disability ever appeared, and their experience of the threat as a repetition allows them, in the face of disability, to, as Platt puts it, reclaim their gender again. Both Platt and Finkelstein end their texts by proclaiming their desire. Finkelstein ends, "Nothing that they did or that has happened, not the streets or abuse or being a crip, has killed it. My desire is still intact. The beauty of desire in all its rawness and untamed hope still leaves my throat scratchy and dry, and it's the taste of glory." Platt ends, "Now my femme is rising again. This lesbian femme with disabilities is wise, wild, wet, and wanting." I read rising again as the mark of a certain phallic temporality, one that manifests as repetition. These stories of lesbian gender and adult onset disability are stories of castration, but the temporality is not one where castration, when it happens, is once and for all. It is where the phallus is lost and then regained more than once in a repetition, rising again. Platt, Waxler, and Finkelstein all tell stories of late onset disability as castration. All end by affirming the persistence of their desire. I want to contrast this phallic temporality with the standard one, where castration, when it occurs, is once and for all. The phallus in the wheelchair. While the previous section of my talk presents texts with alternative sexual temporalities, I chose the text for this section because it is such a clear and familiar version of normative phallic temporality, and because it is quite explicitly and pointedly articulates disability with the phallus. If the wheelchair is, in our culture, the very icon of disability, the wheelchair is most famously linked to castration in D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. In that 1928 novel, Lord Chatterley in his wheelchair is the castrated foil to the phallic hero Mellors. Lady Chatterley's Lover gives us a particularly readable version of the standard castration narrative for adult onset disability. The novel displays a sort of symptomatic overemphasis on Clifford Chatterley's wheeled mobility devices, manifest, for example, in its repeating the same sentence, almost verbatim, in 2 succeeding chapters. In chapter 1, he could wheel himself about in a wheeled chair, and he had a bath chair with a small motor attachment so he could drive himself slowly around the garden and into the park. And in chapter 2, he could wheel himself about in a wheeled chair, and he had a sort of bath chair with a motor attachment in which he could puff slowly around the park. Lady Chatterley's Lover works to ensure that when we think of Lord Chatterley, we think of him in a wheelchair. I want to return to Lawrence's novel, a veritable treasure trove of aggressively normative sexuality. Returning to that novel, I discover an emphasis on temporality. For example, chapter 2 ends thus. Time went on. Whatever happened, nothing happened. Time went on as the clock does, 8:30 instead of 7:30. Exploring the temporal dimensions in Chatterley will allow me to formulate the normative temporality of the phallus and will help outline alternative phallic temporalities. Lady Chatterley's Lover is a celebration of the most normative version of phallic sexuality. When the female protagonist gives herself to the phallic man, she of course becomes pregnant. When she rejects her husband because of his war injury, it is widely and repeatedly said that it is because he cannot give her a child. Although scandalous in 1928 for its explicit sexual scenes, this novel is a paean to the superiority of reproductive sexuality. It is a definite pleasure for me to juxtapose Lady Chatterley's normative phallus with the alternative queer phalluses I have found in lesbian writing. The novel's phallic hero, Mellors, in fact expresses a particular animus for lesbians. It's astonishing, Mellors says, how lesbian women are, consciously or unconsciously. Seems to me they're nearly all lesbian. I could kill them. When I'm with a woman who's really lesbian, I fairly howl in my soul, wanting to kill her. Comments like this make me glad to locate the phallus in S. Naomi Finkelstein's lesbian crip butch mind's eye, instead of in Mellors, who militates here and throughout the novel for the most normative reproductive sexuality in the name of the phallus. I admit to a bit of a revenge urge in relation to Lady Chatterley's Lover. I read that book as a teenage girl in the 1960s trying to keep up with the sexual revolution. This was supposed to be liberating sexuality, and it made me feel completely inadequate. I was, to my horror, like all the women Mellors hated, not so much literally, consciously lesbian, as not properly, complementarily responsive to his celebrated phallic thrusts. It was only many decades later, finding myself in a wheelchair, that I thought of returning to the book to look at Lord Chatterley, to wonder how his disability figured in this expression of normative sexuality. When I did return to the book, I found not only the normative view of disability as castration, but an emphatic sense of castration as a temporal mode. The novel opens thus. Ours is essentially a tragic age. The cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. This was more or less Constance Chatterley's position. The war had brought the roof down over her head. We might recognize this as the classic modernist sense of the effect of the Great War. It is also what I am calling classic castration temporality. This is where the novel locates its heroine and its reader before it introduces any characters or action. Soon enough, it becomes clear that while the tragedy, the cataclysm, seems general in the opening sentences, it specifically refers to what happened to Constance Chatterley's husband. In the very next paragraph we read, "She married Clifford Chatterley in 1917. Then he went back to Flanders to be shipped over to England again, more or less in bits. The lower half of his body, from the hips down, paralyzed forever, crippled forever, knowing he could never have any children, Clifford came home." Paralyzed forever, crippled forever. Forever is the temporal mode here. Its other expression is the never, of never have any children. Because of his war injury, Clifford is a husband who cannot be a father. The effect of this on Lady Chatterley, and in the view of the book, is a generalized sense that ours is essentially a tragic age. When the narrator says, "We are among the ruins are a generalized extrapolation from Clifford, who is more or less in bits. Whatever we might think of Lawrence's set of Lord Chatterley as more or less in bits, I want here to pursue the temporality of the novel's opening. The tragic age, the cataclysm has happened, paralyzed forever, crippled forever. This sense of general tragedy, of forever, that we find in the very first paragraphs of Lady Chatterley's Lover, is what Margaret Gallop calls a decline story. To exemplify the decline story, Gallop quotes Gerald Early writing about his state of mind after a gallstone operation. I knew then, at that inexorable moment, that I had become, finally and forever, middle-aged. Inexorable moment, finally and forever. These are the markers of Gallop's decline story, the markers of tragedy of what I am here calling conventional castration temporality. Gallop discusses decline in relation to the entrance to middle age, an entrance understood as a tragic fall. Clifford Chatterley is, however, only 27 when paralyzed from the hips down. His story is not about aging, but about the loss of the ability to walk, to be upright, and to father children. While these are arguably two different modalities of loss, my point here is that they are confronted through the same temporality, the temporality of finally and forever, of the inexorable moment. Like the entrance to middle age, adult onset disability is framed through the dramatic temporality of forever. While middle age and disability might be two different modalities of loss, many people, in fact, experience them entangled together. Gallep's own personal story, for example, is of a back injury and the onset of chronic back pain as heralding her entry into middle age. Although Finkelstein categorizes her loss as disability, middle aging enters her account as well. That is the difference between me as a butch at 30 and me as a butch at nearly 40, she writes, in her vivid account of becoming a crip butch. On the other hand, while Gerald Early categorizes his loss as entry into middle age, he is actually describing an experience of illness and hospitalization. It is the insistent entanglement of disability and loss of youth that indeed characterizes what Gallop calls the decline story, the dominance of a certain temporality. A third strand in this tangle, I would add, is the loss of sexual potency, attractiveness, sexuality, i.e., castration. In her struggle against decline ideology, Gallop does not allow Early's story to remain in that inexorable temporality. She supplies the needed corrective. In time, Early returned to health, teaching, and a prestigious writing career, Gallop writes. Although he doesn't mention such things, he goes on to show that he did not remain utterly despairing. It would probably have been truer for him to write, I felt for that agonizing moment that middle age was going to be a tragedy forever. I was wrong. Just as Gallop insists that Gerard Early actually had a diverse and full life after his dramatically declared inexorable moment, I want to return to Clifford Chatterley to consider what his life was like after his tragic loss. In particular, I want to look at his sexuality after paralysis. I want to look at how the novel describes the sexuality of the man in the wheelchair. In the last chapter of the novel, after his wife has left him, after she is pregnant by Mellors, and thus after the inexorable has run its course, we find Lord Chatterley in the care of Mrs. Bolton. Their relationship has become increasingly sexual, although the novel shows nothing but contempt for this perverse sexuality. I take the liberty of quoting at some length. He would hold her hand and rest his head on her breast, and when she once lightly kissed him, he said, "Yes, do kiss me, do kiss me." And when she sponged his great blonde body, he would say the same, "Do kiss me," and she would lightly kiss his body anywhere, half in mockery. And he lay with a queer blank face like a child. It was sheer relaxation on his part, letting go all his manhood and sinking back to a childish position that was really perverse. And then he would put his hand into her bosom and feel her breasts and kiss them in exaltation, the exaltation of perversity of being a child when he was a man. The narrator expresses strong disapproval, really perverse, the exaltation of perversity. The disapproval issues from the perspective of normative sexuality. It is not that this isn't sexual, it's that it is a childish sexuality, what Freud, by the time Lawrence is writing, had famously called infantile sexuality. contrasting it with adult reproductive sexuality. In the early 20th century, Freud had established the correlation between perverse and infantile sexuality, and that is indeed what we see here from the perspective of the narrators discussed. It is not that Clifford Chatterley has no sex life, but that his sex life is not normal. I am interested in the exaltation here, the word twice repeated and also bodied forth in all those exclamation points when the text quotes the excited Chatterley, "Yes, do kiss me." Exaltation, the state or feeling of intense, often excessive exhilaration and well-being, rapture, elation. Exaltation and euphoria both involve a sense of extreme personal well-being, but exaltation is the stronger and more elevated term. Exalt, from Latin exaltare, to lift up, from ex up plus altus high. Exaltation connotes intense pleasure, but with an emphasis on verticality. That uplift is particularly interesting in relation to a man in a wheelchair, unable to stand. It is also, I would suggest, phallic. I find this passage sexy. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think I'm the only one. Consider Mrs. Bolton having her breasts felt and kissing his great blonde body anywhere, only half in mockery. Mrs. Bolton was both thrilled and ashamed. She both loved and hated it, and they drew into a closer physical intimacy, an intimacy of perversity. Although the novel portrays her as ambivalent, both sides of her response, thrilled and ashamed, suggest that she recognized this as sexual and responds sexually. Clifford Chatterley's narrative arc begins with his castration in the Great War and seems to continue as an inexorable decline. As the novel progresses, he loses more and more, fulfilling the loss inevitable from the beginning as his wife grows distant from him, cuckolds him, and leaves to have a child by another man. But this late scene with Mrs. Bolton suggests a different phallic temporality, one where the lost phallus can return in another place. What returns is not the normative phallus, the one belonging to a man, not a child, not the phallus that can impregnate a woman, but a perverse phallus, one no less exalting. If we release ourselves from the normative hold of reproductive sexuality, we can enter into other phallic temporalities, where the inability to walk or get it up or be a man does not have to mean castration forever, where the phallus could rise again in the wheelchair or in the mind's eye. Thank you.